Hello, everybody. I'm Kristen Hunter from EXL Events, and on behalf of EXL and the Avoca Group, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on measuring clinical quality with effective metrics. I'm excited to announce that EXL Events and the Avoca Group have recently established a formal partnership to work together and better provide the industry with valuable information and events. We at EXL have always enjoyed working with the Avoca Group and strongly believe in the value they're providing the industry through their Avoca Quality Consortium, and are excited to formalize this partnership and continue to work together and provide you offerings like this webinar. There's just a few technical things I'd like to address before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a menu bar. There's a Q&A box there available to submit questions, so if you're having any technical difficulties or if you have questions throughout, please go ahead and submit them through this box. We do want this to be interactive, and we will be pausing at various points throughout the presentation to address any questions that have come in. We also have several other boxes visible around the slides, providing you with access to relevant resources and events. I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Denise Calla-Price, who is a senior consultant at the Avoca Group. Denise has a bachelor's degree in biology from Harvard and her MS and PhD from Princeton. She has extensive experience directing clinical research programs and building innovative development and operational strategies in a variety of settings, including academia, government, a CRO, a large global pharma, and a small biotech. She's been working at Avoca for the past 14 years, and among many other accomplishments, she's developed a novel quality metrics taxonomy that she will be speaking about today. But before we get to Denise, I'm going to pass it over to Lori Jones, who's the Associate Director of Marketing and Client Engagement at the Avoca Group, and is going to get us started.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kristen. And before Denise begins her presentation, I'm going to take just a few moments to explain for those on the call who may not yet be familiar with the Avoca Quality Consortium what it is. And this is the backdrop for the information and knowledge that Denise will be sharing with you today. So what is the Avoca Quality Consortium? It is an industry collaborative consisting of pharma and biotech companies, CROs, and other types of providers that work in the clinical trial execution space. Its focus is on operationalizing proactive approaches to quality and risk management. And the second slide represents our member companies. We have about 80 companies in the consortium. It's a varied group of the largest companies in the industry and small to mid-sized organizations on both the pharma and service provider side. If you work for a company that's part of our membership and you don't see your company's logo on the slide, I'm sorry, if you are with a company that has a logo on the slide and you don't have credentials to the Avoca Quality Consortium Knowledge Center, please reach out to us. We will be glad to provide you with your credentials. And then finally, this slide is a timeline of the consortium. As you can see, it was started 7 years ago. And over that time, we have worked on many different initiatives focused on improving and streamlining clinical trial execution. And we continually update documentation as regulations change, and we're always adding new work streams. And you can also see on here that we have, on the 2013 year, we have the creation of the Streamlined Quality Metrics Taxonomy and Framework, which Denise will be speaking about today. So before Denise begins, I am just going to ask the audience a polling question. I would like to see what type of organizations we have on the call today. So if you could please check the box next to your answer. What type of organization are you currently employed with? And then we will take a look at the results. Okay, we have mostly biopharmaceutical companies On this webinar, we have a small portion of CROs and a variety of other service providers. So thank you very much for taking that poll. And now, Denise, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Welcome everybody this morning. Thank you for joining us. As Lori described, at the AQC, our mission is to improve and streamline clinical operations, specifically as it relates to the achievement of quality, of course. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is basically the metric segment of our quality journey, as you see illustrated here. This is a version of the slide that Lori just showed you with the metrics items highlighted. And what we're going to do really is talk to you not only about what we've done, but about the merits of the general approach that we've taken to developing a quality metrics taxonomy and how such an approach might also benefit your organization. So in terms of our journey on quality metrics, this is something, as you can see, that we started out with very early on after we began the Quality Consortium. And we did that because we are believers in the provision of very practical approaches, practical tools and processes that our membership can use to really achieve higher quality and more efficient outcomes. And so we needed a way to be able to really allow them to measure what they were achieving. So it's really fundamental to our work that we have a way to measure quality and the path to quality. When we started this work in 2012, we started it the same way we started some of our other work, which was to gather a lot of what our members were doing. And the way we do a lot of our work is to gather our member processes, our member materials, and then to go through them and add our own expertise to them and really deliver back the best of the best. As it turned out, that process did not work so well with quality metrics back in 2012. So we had to kind of start from scratch and conceptually and work our way from what we were trying to achieve back to the metrics that could achieve them, rather than from the metrics we collected forward to what we were trying to achieve. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that journey today. So the way that journey looked, and this is the same way this webinar will progress, is that first we're going to talk about what we saw when we did collect quality metrics from our membership, from the industry, and also did some survey research on that topic. And then we're going to talk about what we decided to do with that information, how we moved forward, and how what we did, we believe, addressed deficiencies in what we were seeing in the industry. And then we'll walk even forward from that. Once we had that metric taxonomy, how we were able to use that to provide further processes for our membership, including good processes for rational and efficient metric reporting and review, and ultimately even taking that taxonomy and leveraging it to help identify and mitigate risks to quality. Okay, so to start with the research that we did and our observations, looking at dozens and dozens of sets of companies' quality metrics, and also, like I said, our observations from survey research on the topic. The first thing that we immediately saw when we collected all of this was that across the industry, at least back in 2012, there really wasn't any consistent definition of a quality metric at all, not only across companies, but even within companies. Quality metrics were variously defined as basically anything that could be conceived in any way to relate to what people thought of as quality. So some of them were things that defined quality. What does it look like to have quality at the end of the day, your outcome? Some of the metrics were things that predicted quality, for example, a score on a tool that was meant to assess quality for something. Some of them were metrics that related to tasks that are executed in an attempt to produce quality. Some of them were pure compliance-related things, regulatory things. Others were even just pure QA operational kinds of metrics. How many audits are we doing? Are they in compliance with our plans, and so on? So as a result of not having any consistent definition of a quality metric, what we saw when we compiled metrics across many, many companies is that we got, I think, literally hundreds of metrics that were really just all over the map with no consistent, very consistent theme, except that they were in some way related to quality. Not surprisingly then, what we concluded from this and what we saw when we talked to individual companies as well, both in our consulting and in this exercise, was that companies really didn't have good frameworks for evaluating what constituted a quality metric and for classifying quality metrics according to the audiences that they were meant to serve, the questions that they were meant to answer, how they related to other metrics within a quality metrics suite, and so on. Basically, what had typically happened for companies assembling quality metrics is that somebody would be put in charge, and that person would go around to all the different functional areas and say, give me your quality metrics, and they would supply various lists that had to do with whatever the individual supplying the metrics felt a quality metric to be. They'd all get assembled into a big list that was not usually really scrutinized by anybody. And that became then generally, often a giant list of 80+ metrics that kind of everybody looked at and just looked for red flags on them. So the issue with this really is that there was a lot of proliferation in companies' metrics list. There are too many metrics there without a good assignment. A lot of them redundant. A lot of them focused in the same areas without a good assignment for their purposes and discrete purposes. There were also gaps. If nobody happened to provide metrics that covered a certain aspect of quality, there generally was not anybody really looking in a structured way to say, hey, we don't have anything related to X. Frequently, the design of the metric itself was just one of convenience or one that the person providing happened to use and not necessarily appropriate for review at the levels of the audience that would ultimately see them. There was a big list without clear review and action accountabilities. And beyond that, just very limited ability to then take that list and do some of the more sophisticated things with it that we'd like metrics to be able to do, which is really to help us with root cause analysis and ultimately with optimization of quality outcomes. A third major problem we saw is that once there was a list of metrics, like I mentioned before, basically everybody looked at everything on it without very clear assignment for action, very clear definition of the different roles of people who might be looking at and using metrics and what they were all supposed to do. Generally, it was a big list that had thresholds and things were green, yellow, and red, and nobody really looked at very much unless it was red, and then it was dealt with at some sort of level. Okay, so we recognized that we were not going to get very far by taking all these lists and assembling them and delivering it back to everybody. We actually took a stab at that at first, and it just didn't work out very well. So we decided, okay, let's go back to the very basics and figure out what we're trying to do here. Start from the beginning. What are we trying to measure? How can we best measure it? And then take all of these inputs and kind of assess them according to what we're trying to do and try to organize them into something that's really useful. So that's the first thing we did is we developed this quality metrics taxonomy, which I'll talk to you about in just a second. We classified metrics according to that taxonomy and came up with what we felt were the best of the best metrics to populate the full taxonomy so that we were able to deliver a very high quality catalog of quality metrics. We then developed a catalog of operational metrics that contributed to quality. And we went on ultimately to develop, as I mentioned before, tools for how to leverage the taxonomy to create rational review processes and analytical processes, and ultimately also to assess and mitigate risk. So starting with the taxonomy itself, as I mentioned, we went back to the very basics and said, okay, what we're trying to do is measure and manage quality. So how do we start? The obvious way to start was to say, okay, well, what is quality? What are we trying to measure and manage? And so we went back to the CTTI definition of quality at the time, which was the ability to effectively and efficiently answer the intended question about the benefits and risks of a medical product or procedure while assuring patient safety and protection of human subjects. So that's really, we were happy with that definition, and we said, okay, that's what we are trying to measure when we're trying to measure quality. That's what we're trying to achieve. It's not exactly the same as compliance. It's really not at all the same as compliance. What we came to philosophically was that basically regulations and procedures are designed to corner organizations into delivering quality by this definition, to support us in delivering quality by this definition, but they themselves do not define quality. So that was a subject of a lot of debate, but that's where we came to on our quality metrics. Quality is not quality assurance operations. Once again, quality assurance operational activities, audits, etc., deviations, those are all designed to support us in achieving quality, but they do not define quality. Likewise, the time and cost of achieving quality, those are separate dimensions. That has to do with efficiency, but that is not here in the definition of quality. So we really wanted to focus on measuring quality. Now, that definition I really like, but it contains a lot of components, too many components to assign a measurement to. There's no way to assign one score that effectively grabs everything in that definition. So we started to break it down. And basically, we took that definition first and we broke it down into 7 major categories. The first 4 here in blue are the 4 major components of quality of any scientific experiment. So it's basically that you have a scientifically valid and ethically sound experimental design. You execute your study faithfully according to that design. You accurately capture everything that happened when you executed that study faithfully according to its design, and then you interpreted it correctly and skillfully, and you reported it in a fashion that gave the answer to the questions. Because we are doing this on people, we also have to adequately protect their rights and their safety and welfare. And because we're doing this in a regulatory environment, in a regulated environment, we have to document and submit everything we do in a certain way as evidence that we've done all of these things. Otherwise, essentially, we don't get credit for it. Now, even those concepts are too big to assign metrics to. So our next step was to take each of those 7 major categories and break those down into outcome components. And the goal of these outcome components is that they are conceptually distinct and measurable. And basically, they're broken down into pieces that we would know what to do with. So if, for example, if we just had a measurement of protocol quality that was not optimal, we don't really know what to do with that. If we break it down into whether it answers the scientific question effectively and efficiently versus whether it's feasible versus whether it's written clearly and unambiguously, then we have more direction for what to do with it. So we broke each of these buckets down into components. So this is the one for protocols. We then, in terms of execution of study as per protocol, including all involved personnel being qualified, we broke that down into personnel qualifications, following the protocol closely enough to have confidence in the data from subjects included in the analysis, and having sufficient subjects evaluable for valid analysis. You will get these slides, or these slides will be made available to you afterwards, so I'm going to go through this quickly. Don't worry about getting every word, but I want to show you here basically how we proceeded to get metrics out of this organization. So in terms of integrity of data, again, there are a couple of major concepts here. One is whether you captured everything at all, whether you captured anything that was important in your database, and the other thing was whether the data that are in the database are accurate. So we broke it down into components related to that. In terms of the integrity of the analysis, free of errors, clearly expressed, correctly interpreted, and the right plan for it. Adequate protection of subjects' rights. This involves items related to consent, appropriate ethics committee interactions, and protection of privacy. Adequate protection of subject safety and welfare. We boiled that down into components revolving around the collection and assembly of safety data, the quality and timeliness of the reviews, and basically issuance of information back to investigators and patients, and appropriate action if necessary. And in terms of the regulatory compliance with documentation and so on, we boiled that down into components having to do with basically document collection and storage and reporting to regulatory authorities. So that basically summarizes how we defined what quality was and everything we were trying to achieve. We then realized that it was not enough to basically take all of those and put measurements on them, because those measurements would just describe the outcomes, whether we achieved those things at the end of the day. By the time we get to outcomes, of course, it's too late to do anything about it. So although we do need to have measurements for all of those components and define whether we achieved outcomes with respect to all those areas of quality, we also need to have other metrics to help us manage quality. We need to have leading metrics, which we call predictors of outcomes, that are closely tied to the outcomes statistically, things that we can look at and say, are we going on track? These basically usually fall into two categories. One is partial outcomes. So if I'm looking for protocol compliance at the end of the day, I can look for that month by month, and that will be a predictor of how it ends up. And then there are other metrics like that are just statistically correlated to outcomes, which might be the score on a tool that's designed to lead to an outcome, or compliance with certain tasks that have been statistically demonstrated to correlate strongly with outcomes, enough so that they can be used as leading indicators. Beyond that, though, there are also a lot of other things that we do to promote quality, a lot of tasks where they might not have an extremely strong statistical correlation, partly because it's many different tasks at the same time that synergistically help move us to quality. But nevertheless, we realize that these are important contributors to quality outcomes. And we want a way of measuring those too. A lot of those, like I said, are task-oriented. They're operational-oriented. Some companies include these as quality metrics. Some just include them as operational metrics that they understand connect to quality. But basically, those are another important category of metrics in a suite of quality metrics. So as an example, for protocol execution, an outcome metric might be the % of subjects evaluable for analysis at the end of the study. That's what we achieved at the end of the day. That defines quality in that respect on that study. A predictor might be the % of subjects or visits with protocol deviations during the study, perhaps assessed monthly. And contributors might relate to the various things that have happened or that we do to try to keep those on track. For example, initiate sites shortly before they begin to enroll patients so that they have a very fresh memory of the details of how to execute the protocol. Keeping monitoring visits in compliance with the plan so that we can keep on top of anything that's happened, course correct, and so on. Or % of site personnel completing protocol-specific training on time. Those are all things that we do to contribute to quality in that area. So basically, once we put this all together, we end up with a grid. We have on the left the 7 major buckets of quality, and then we have those divided into a bunch of outcomes and for outcome components. And then for each of those, we have a metric to measure the outcome component, and then we have predictor metrics, and then we have contributor metrics. Once we have all of those, we have a clear path to understanding how we get to quality for a particular item and how we can tell if we're on or off track to that. We also recognize that there are some things that we do that contribute to quality, but in a very general way, not just to one specific outcome. So we have things like adequacy of personnel, adequacy of plans, issue detection and handling and resolution procedures. So at the AQC, we developed sort of a separate supportive quality suite of metrics to handle things like that, recognizing that they were important, but not necessarily attached to one specific outcome. So at the AQC, what we've done with this basically is to use this grid to go through and make sure that every cell has a metric and a high quality, well-designed metric, and that all of these different metrics do what they are supposed to do, thus resulting in a complete suite that covers all of the bases of quality and the path to all of those quality outcomes. In terms of our recommendations for what you can do, some of those are as follows. We recommend that you identify a central owner of a metric catalog, somebody who's actually knowledgeable and responsible for going through the whole thing and ensuring completeness and ensuring that things that don't belong there aren't there. We recommend that you identify the purposes and the audience for the quality metrics so you really understand exactly what part of that grid you are trying to work with and what you're trying to achieve. We recommend that you use some sort of framework like that, either one like the AQC framework, or you could come up with your own, to really get a rational view of exactly what you're trying to measure and the path to that. And then map the metrics you have to that, identify gaps, and identify things that don't belong there at all and maybe should be in a different measurement suite. And then once you identify the gaps, create a wish list. And we recommend starting with the outcome and predictor metrics because those really are what's important. A lot of companies do start with the contributor metrics, the task metrics, because that's what they have. And then they end up stopping there and not really being able to look at the path between what they're doing and what they're trying to get. Once you have that wish list, map that wish list to what you can get right away, and then create a prioritization plan for acquiring things that aren't immediately available but that you recognize are important. Once you get that down with the outcome and predictor metrics, we recommend that you could then boil down to the contributor level metrics and start populating your metric catalog in that fashion. So that's the basics of our metric taxonomy. And before I move on to talk about how we've leveraged that to develop good review and risk assessment procedures, I'm going to stop for a minute to see if there are anything needing clarification or any questions on the taxonomy. I think Lisa will be assembling questions, if any.
Right. Denise, I don't have anything so far. Perhaps we can wait until the end.
Okay, we'll move along. That means hopefully that everything I presented was clear. Like I said, you'll be getting the slides if you would desire at the end, so you'll have a chance to pour through this a little more in detail. Okay, so we're going to move on to talk about the metric review and reporting and how that taxonomy can help us be efficient and effective with that. One of the things that I mentioned in the beginning in terms of our major findings was that even if there was a comprehensive, sometimes too comprehensive catalog of quality metrics in a company, often the utility of that catalog was very much limited by the fact that there was really no clear pathway from looking at the metrics to doing all the things that need to be or can be done to really leverage the value of those metrics. And some of that had to do with process, a lack of procedure and accountability for who exactly is in charge of what and what pathway they'll take to dealing with it. But some of that also had to do with the fact that even though the measurements might actually be all the same, because everybody's ultimately after the same thing. Quality is the same thing across whether it's a study or organizational level or functional level or so on. Different audiences have different specific accountabilities that require different derivatives of those measurements to really make their jobs easy. And that's something that we'll walk through now, something we've also seen in our consulting a lot of companies have struggled with. So in again, getting our thoughts very organized on this topic, we defined 4 major roles that need to review metrics or that can benefit from reviewing quality metrics. One of them is the study level manager. That person is responsible for just delivering a specific study with high quality. Another role is a higher level business unit manager, so somebody who might be in charge of the whole enterprise or all of clinical development, somebody who might be in charge of a therapeutic area or a country or some other division who's responsible for a whole portfolio of studies and delivering quality in that respect. There are resource managers like CRO alliance managers or functional resource managers, and then there are process managers, those people responsible for designing a process that will contribute to a quality outcome. And they have 4 very different sets of questions they need to answer by looking at quality metrics. Okay, so how does the taxonomy help us define accountabilities and define who should be looking at what, assign the right metrics to the right people? Well, we really went one audience at a time and asked ourselves, at the study level, what's your accountability and what should you be focusing at? And really the job of a study manager is to lead a particular study down a path that results in good quality outcomes. So the outcome metrics are something that the study manager needs to deliver, but those aren't as important for the study manager to review because by the time those are available, that person's job is basically over. What a study manager really needs to focus on is looking very regularly along the way at the predictor metrics and making very sure that all of those different things are happening and leading to quality. And then if they're not, doing something with that, drilling down to say, okay, what different tasks contribute to quality in this area? Why is it going wrong? Going down and identifying that and dealing with the people responsible for that. To get it fixed. Also, when there are risks identified that put a particular area at risk, say quality of execution, the study manager will probably want to, from the very beginning, drill down further on that just to really be careful to identify any trends or anything in that direction. In contrast, if you are at a higher level of management, say you're responsible for a whole portfolio of 50 studies in the immunology area, your responsibility is not only to ensure study by study that things are going well, but also to look systemically across your whole organization at the patterns. And are you delivering quality? Are the studies in your portfolio consistently resulting in high quality? Are they delivering quality? Are there systemic areas where things need to be worked on or where you have particular strengths that maybe could be shared with other therapeutic areas or countries or whatever it is? So you have two sets of things you really need to look at. You really need to look at the outcome metrics. How are all the studies in my portfolio ending up? As well as the predictor metrics. How are the studies in my portfolio progressing along? The contributor metrics, all the tasks and so on, those shouldn't be as important to people at this level unless they need to drill down to them because they see a problem. But rather than just looking at all of the outcome metrics and the predictor metrics one study at a time, it's useful for people at this level to be looking at the fraction of studies in their portfolio that are achieving acceptable levels. Because if you have 50 studies in your portfolio and you look at them one study at a time, it makes it very difficult to identify what are my strengths and weaknesses and what do I need to focus my organization on. So those people will need different derivatives of these metrics. Fraction of studies achieving acceptable levels of quality in all of these different areas. Resource level reviewers have a similar job to the higher level business unit reviewers. These people might be responsible for all of the portfolio of studies that a particular CRO is working on, or a particular SMO is working on, or a particular group of internal staff are working on. So similarly, they need to, just like the higher level business unit reviewers, they need to look at how all the outcomes are going and the fraction of studies that are achieving acceptable outcomes, as well as study by study how things are progressing toward those outcomes. Resource level reviewers may also be interested in contributor level metrics, so operational and task level metrics, in terms of just making sure that any task related or operational level commitments are being achieved. And finally, process-level reviewers have a whole other remit. Their job is to design processes and ensure that the processes that they design, when executed, result in the outcomes that need to be achieved. So if I am a business process owner, say for protocol-specific training, my job is to make sure that the protocol-specific training I'm designing is leading to good quality protocol execution. So what I'm going to be looking at is relationships. I want to see if there is compliance with my process, because that tells me whether it's achievable, basically, and whether people understand it. But I also want to look at the relationship between compliance with my process and the outcome metrics. So, for example, if there's 100% compliance with protocol-specific training, and yet there's a high level of errors in protocol execution because people don't understand the protocol, that means there's a problem with my process. So that relationship is something that I need to know and be able to look at and act on. If there's good compliance, bad outcome, my process is not adequate. I need to go back and revisit it. So basically, as an example here, if we look at protocol execution, and our basic thing we're looking at is the subjects with protocol violations compared over the total number of randomized subjects. Different audiences will look at this in different ways. At the study level, they need to know, is my study on track to achieve quality in this respect? So I'm going to look at this metric on a monthly basis, say, ongoing, maybe even more frequently depending on the study. At an enterprise level, therapeutic area level, resource level, I'm going to additionally look at what % of our studies are on track to achieve adequate quality, and also what percentage of our studies have achieved adequate quality in this respect. I need to see if there's a domain level problem and where the domain level problems are. At the process level, I'm going to be looking at correlations between the processes I'm in charge of and this metric. So is there a relationship between training, compliance, monitoring, visit frequency, and so on, and this outcome that I am trying to achieve with my process? If there is not, then I need to revisit my process. Maybe this monitoring visit frequency isn't enough. Maybe the monitors aren't doing what they're supposed to do, so on. Okay, so that summarizes that. So at a very basic level, what I just described is important to understand, for people in each role to understand in terms of what they're trying to get out of the metrics, what they're accountable for. What we have seen our clients do at a more advanced level is really come up with very good role-specific flowcharts and role-specific metric suites. These are the metrics you need to look at, and this is what you need to do if your metrics look good and don't look good. If they don't look good, you need to filter in these ways, you need to talk to these people, you need to do these actions, and so on. And these kinds of flowcharts can be very effective. To really get the most out of them, you can actually, and we don't see as many companies who have achieved this whole path, but certainly some and more who are working on it, you can get all the way to an optimization level. Once you really understand and have the things going on in that flow chart humming along, you can really optimize what resources you allocate to what tasks and who does what and how in order to really optimize quality. So our recommendations here, again, that you have a clear, restricted, and documented purpose for each audience's review as we described, or you can use your own paradigm for that, but basically using some sort of rational organizational system to be very clear on who's trying to achieve what, and then leverage your taxonomy to basically guide people to the categories of things, categories of metrics that they need to be focusing on, and the types of analyses and derivatives they need to be focusing on. And then create a plan for making sure that data are gathered in a timely fashion so that what people are looking at, they know really is meaningful, and they can act on it accordingly. A cascading dashboard can be very useful in this respect in terms of a technology enabler with role-specific views, cascade views, and so on, drill up, drill down. Here's an example of just one sort of dashboard that we designed at one point that allows you in a role-specific way to look at your metrics, see quickly whether they're in range or out of range, what the trend is, and then to drill up to upstream metrics, to downstream metrics, to audit findings related to those metrics, to other quality issues. So this is all qualitative information relating to those metrics, et cetera, and be able to filter, as you see at the bottom, by resource, region, phase, and study. This is really optimally where you could get to with using metrics and related information for quality management. Okay, I'm going to stop there again and see if there are any questions on what I've gone through so far before we launch into our last section on connecting this to risk assessment and management.
Denise, there are a number of questions this time, and some are from an earlier section. The first one was, where do you get the data and which sources do you use?
Where do we get the data? I think that, if you're talking about the actual metric data, like the actual fraction of subjects that have protocol violations and so on, that's not something we do at the AQC. We don't actually, we design the taxonomy, we design the metrics themselves, in other words, the calculations and so on, but in terms of actually populating them with data from particular studies, we don't collect data from specific studies. We know that with every different company, they'll have different partners or systems and so on. And we do have in our tools spaces where we have like these grids for all of the metrics. We do have columns that walk users through the process of making sure they have identified exactly where all of the data comes from, who's responsible for populating it, and so on. But that's going to vary from company to company.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how many quantifiable metrics on average by domain would you recommend?
Quantifiable metrics by domain. I am not sure what is meant by domain in that question, but it really depends. The number of metrics I think people should be looking at really depends a lot on who they are, what they're trying to do, and what's going on, if there are particular issues or risks. I think at the highest level, I like to see people on their first pass, like in that dashboard, looking at no more than about 20 metrics, even if they're responsible across the whole portfolio of quality. If all of those are looking good and they're satisfied that their resources are on top of all the steps that lead up to them and there's no particular risks, I think they can basically look at those. I mean, that basically boils down to the the 7 categories and the major components and the predictors or outcomes associated with those components. If there are issues or risks in an area, then, like I said, I recommend drilling down and trying to figure out what's going on there so that it can be fixed. And that will then involve looking at more metrics. But I don't typically like to see anybody with a given role, a given responsibility, looking at all 80 or 100 of those metrics in the first place. If everybody's well trained and everybody knows what they're responsible to look at and to do, that should not be necessary.
Okay, I have a couple more questions, and a reminder that this webinar is being taped and will be available, and the slides will be available, and Avoca will be available to answer questions that come up. The next one is interesting. How have recommended quality metrics evolved with recent changes to ICH E6R2? Is there more focus on operational quality systems?
I don't think the whole system, the whole taxonomy and the recommendations we make has really changed. People might use them differently, label them differently. We've actually taken the whole taxonomy and tied every section of it, all of our metrics, to the sections of ICH E6R2 that they relate to, and kind of made sure that we had kind of a cross-check there for the relevance. But I don't think it really changes that much. What it might have influenced more is what I'll go on to talk about next, which is really looking at things not only in terms of what's going on, issues and outcomes, but also in terms of risks to outcomes and being more proactive.
Okay, and I'll move on to one more. We have some more information to go over that Denise will be presenting, but again, we will be able to get to all these questions after the webinar. But the next question, and I'll kind of combine two, so for a virtual company or for heavily outsourced studies, do you have any, could you address challenges on obtaining interfacing metrics or data where all these functional outsources or functional areas are outsourced?
On obtaining the data themselves? Is that what you're saying?
Let me read it again. Please address challenges on obtaining interfacing metrics / data for a virtual company where all functional areas are outsourced. And a follow-up question is, for heavily outsourced studies, do you have experience with a quality agreement which would incorporate quality metrics?
Yes, yeah. So I think that these bring up some very good points that we don't have a lot of time to go through, which have to do with your outsourcing model and making sure all of your metric suites and the expectations and the documentation are all well aligned to that model. And yes, we do recommend that metrics be incorporated in all associated plans, so quality agreements, if they're in monitoring plans, data management plans, all of those things should incorporate metrics as well as who is looking at what in the metrics and what they're responsible for doing. Because all of those plans are designed to basically promote quality, so they should include what gets measured to assess whether you're on track for it and who does what with that. In terms of the virtual outsourcing and getting the information, all I can really say on that is that I think any company that's outsourcing, they need to have their own set of metrics and their own set of expectations so that they know what's important to them to get, especially in a virtual environment where they're not doing a lot of micro oversight. I do see a lot of sponsors basically taking a passive role on this and saying, well, this is what our provider gives us, so this is all that we have. I see that as inadequate. Ultimately, as a sponsor, you are in charge of ensuring that quality is happening on your studies, so you should have your own definition of what that is. And then at the vendor selection level, basically say, I need you to provide me with this. And if you really feel confident that this defines a quality outcome that's important, you should be able to insist on getting that from your provider. And typically, if you take an active role on that, what I've seen is that it'll happen. If you have good justification for it. If you take a passive role on it, you probably will not get everything that you need. That's what I've seen anyway.
All right, I see lots of fantastic questions, but I'm going to turn it back over to you, Denise, so that you can finish the information you'd like.
Okay, I'll move quickly through the rest so that hopefully we can address some more of those questions. So basically, as I was just saying in response to one of those questions, something that's come up more recently is the industry has moved toward more of an interest in proactive management of quality and not just management of it as things are moving along, is to go back and see how to take as a new expectation that it's not just enough for us to kind of bump along in a study or in a department and see how quality is going and course correct. We should be able to back away and say, okay, what proactively do we know that could put quality at risk, and how do we best assess and manage that? And to make a long story short, basically we tackled this as another area in the AQC and have done research on it and found that we really ended up kind of in the same place we did that led us to the quality metrics, is that companies aren't using the same terminology for risk. They don't really have an organizational system for the different things that they're defining as risk, and so it makes it very difficult to construct a measurement system to measure risk when there are all these different things going on. So what we've seen here is that risk can be used, and often is used, to mean anything along the spectrum from something that could conceivably happen that we have no real reason to believe that could happen, but it would be a risk if it did. So site activation may be delayed long past training, all the way up to things that are already happening, things that have happened, or things that affect the influence when a bad thing happens. So all of these things here are used when the word risk, or are intended when the word risk is used, but they're very, very different things in terms of identification and management. So we decided that we needed a framework to basically, just like we did with quality, boil down risk and what it was in all these different ways, and then we could use that framework to try to populate it to make sure we had a good system for measuring and managing risk. So once again, we boiled down to some very basic definitions, and we are aware, of course, that there are more regulatory definitions for these, but basically the very fundamental definitions of risk versus issue are that risks are things that may happen, the possibility that something may happen or something that may cause something to happen, whereas issue is already a problem that's in development. And we created this terminology to look at risk. So basically we boiled things down into 5 different categories of things that could be assessed with respect to risk. At the most fundamental level is the risk driver, which would be any variable that could influence the probability or consequences of an adverse outcome. So these are things that could happen, like I said, hypothetical, theoretical. Risk events are things that happen when some of those things actually do happen. They haven't created a problem yet, but now there's been an event. So whereas a risk driver might be the potential for high staff turnover due to competition for CRAs, a risk event means, okay, now we're having high CRA turnover. We haven't yet seen that in any of our actual quality outcomes, but now something's happened that we know that those could really be at risk. An emerging issue means that something is actually starting to happen. So now we see a high fraction of patients with major protocol violations during the study. This is not the end of the day yet. The study isn't ruined, but it's something that is actually in the process of happening. So that creates now a very real and immediate risk to the outcome. There's a realized risk, which basically means that now this has already happened. It's the same thing as an outcome. We don't have enough patients evaluable for a robust efficacy analysis. And then we have something entirely separate, which is a risk consequence that basically says, okay, now that this has happened, or now if it's on track to happen, if it does happen, how bad is it going to be? So what are the consequences basically to the company? Now, when we looked at this, what we realized is that a lot of this was already incorporated into the taxonomy that we had. So the risk drivers, the things that could hypothetically happen, the things that could influence quality, we didn't have any space for those in our taxonomy. But the risk events, the emerging issues, and the realized risks were all things that were already in there. The risk events were generally things that we saw at the contributor level, things that could happen that could influence quality. The emergent issues were things, the predictor metrics, basically things that we were already seeing happen that had an immediate potential to ruin the outcome if not acted upon. And then the realized risks could be measured through our outcome metrics. Risk consequences, again, were other things that that are not incorporated in our taxonomy. So basically, we could basically use the framework that we already had as a risk management framework if we just added this layer on top where we think about the risk drivers that could create risk for all of the different outcome categories, and we thought about the consequences of that. But all of these other things are things that we could use the existing taxonomy and catalog for, but just thinking about it in terms of managing risk. So basically our recommendations in terms of risk assessment are twofold. And one of those is to take your taxonomy, your catalog, if it is well organized in the way that we describe, and use that to look at things from a risk perspective. It basically is already, like I said, folded in there when you have a direct path from the outcome back to the things that you do to achieve the outcome. The second way to leverage that taxonomy to assess risk is basically just to use the framework as a thinking tool. Once you see all those distinct things of what define quality, what the outcome components are, what the things are that contribute to those outcome components, then you have a very systematic and comprehensive tool for going piece by piece and asking yourselves, well, what would put this at risk? What would put this at risk? What would put this at risk? Rather than just basically brainstorming with a blank piece of paper about risks, which is what we see a lot of companies do. So an example of how to use this, risk drivers, these hypothetical circumstances believed to impact the probability of adverse outcomes. These are things that can be brainstormed by the team, sitting down with the taxonomy, and like I said, looking category by category at the beginning before they've even finished the protocol, before they've even started the study, and thought about and addressed in ideally quality by design approaches, and also addressed in designing the oversight or vigilance mechanism for each of these different areas. So if a particular area is defined, say again, protocol execution, as having a lot of risk drivers associated with it, then you might say, you know what, for this area, we're going to have to really look at a lot of detailed level metrics because we really think that there are a lot of risk drivers loading down the protocol execution area. And some of them we can't address in quality by design approaches, but we can address in greater vigilance. Risk events, things that are actually starting to happen. Again, those can be, once those are defined, discussed throughout the trial, influence vigilance, influence the planning and triggering of mitigations, influence possible amendments to things if now the level of risk is elevated by risk events starting to happen, and so on. Emerging issues, these are things, like I said, that are already actualizing in predictor metrics. Those can be addressed in just the typical issue management way, triggering contingency plans and so on. Outcomes, those can be addressed obviously through damage control and continued implementation of contingency plans and considerations for lessons learned, process improvement, vendor assessment, all of those other higher business unit level things that we talked about in the review section. And then consequence drivers. Those are similar to the risk drivers in the beginning, where you could take them into account and what would be the consequences of things going bad in a particular area. And what can we do about that up front? Okay, I'm going to, I know we're right at the end, but I'm going to see if there's time for one or two more questions.
Denise, I think the greatest number of questions were asking you for a sample of some predictive metrics.
Examples of predictive metrics. Well, those, like I said, they tend to fall into two categories. Some of them are basically fractional parts of outcome metrics. So where are we this month with respect to something that we're going to look at the end of the day? So if an outcome metric is the fraction of subjects that have executed consent or repeated consent, updated consent in a proper manner, then we would look at that on a week-by-week, month-by-month basis as a predictor metric for what the actual outcome is going to be, so we can course correct. Protocol violations, another one of those. So those are the fractional ones. Other examples of predictor metrics, like I said, are maybe things that are designed to be predictive. For example, we have a protocol quality tool that measures the steps that were taken and what was done basically to make sure that you had a high quality protocol to begin with. That generates a score. That score can be predictive of the number of amendments required or the number of violations that result from a not very clear protocol. So that's a separate category of thing that's designed to be predictive.
Okay, and maybe one more question, actually two questions kind of related. So how do you use metrics to drive change? And then what methods do you use to make sure individuals remain accountable?
Yeah, well, those are good questions, and they're similar, related questions. How can you use metrics to drive change? That really boils down to, like I said before, assigning accountabilities, making sure that people understand what they're supposed to be doing when they're looking at metrics. So if you're talking about change in a process, the process owner needs to understand that it is part of their job to look at metrics in the way that I described, that they need to be looking at compliance with their processes and the relationships between the compliance with their processes and the outcomes they're trying to achieve. Once that's really well defined as their job, they're held accountable for that the way you are held accountable for any other part of your job. Likewise for resource level managers, business unit managers, and so on. If it is defined as part of their job that you are looking at quality metrics across the whole portfolio of studies that you're responsible for, and you are accountable for keeping them in acceptable range, then that's part of your job. You know that you have to say what areas are my studies achieving quality in and what are they not, and you're going to have to report on that, and it may be part of your objectives and so on. So what I'm really seeing, I think the accountability in this area should be like the accountability in any other area. What I really see where the deficiency is that there is not a good organizational structure and review structure set up for metrics so that you can really hold people accountable for it. Once you develop that, and then the other thing is that sometimes even when that's there or it's getting close, for whatever reason, just culturally as an industry, we don't really hold people responsible for doing this part of their job.
Okay, we've had great questions. I think just to review with everyone, we will get back to you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Denise. That was excellent. There's a lot of questions, and people were very interactive, so I appreciate that. So thank you to everyone who is in attendance. We will be emailing you the on-demand version of the webinar as well as the PDF of the slides, so look for that email tomorrow. To learn more from Avoca and many other topics on optimizing clinical operations, you can join us at the Crown Congress, which is taking place January 23rd to 25th in Philadelphia. We have a special discount available for the webinar participants that will also be included in tomorrow's email. And again, thank you so much, Denise, and thank you to the Avoca group, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Yes, thank you, everybody, for the great questions and for your attendance.
Wonderful.